experiment. I thank the chair and yield the floor. Notice the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Senator from New York.
I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection. The Senate will now observe a moment of silence for the 40th anniversary of the Munich Olympics massacre.
Mr. President,
Senator from New York.
I stand here today with my colleagues to observe 1 minute of silence on the first day of session since the passage of the 40th anniversary of the 1972 Munich Olympic terrorist attack, which killed 11 athletes and coaches from the Israeli Olympic team. Prior to the extraordinary Summer Games in London, where so many of our athletes excelled and made our country so proud, the Senate passed a bipartisan resolution that I authored with Senator Rubio. With this resolution, which was supported by more than 30 of our colleagues, the Senate called on the International Olympics Committee to hold a moment of silence in London to honor these 11 slain Israeli Olympians. It's regrettable that they chose not to. Today, here in the Senate, in this body, we right that wrong. The Munich tragedy was an outrageous attack against innocent athletes and against the unifying spirit of the Olympics. Observing a moment of silence at the 2012 Olympic Games opening ceremony, when the world's attention was focused on this symbol of international cooperation and peace, it would have sent such a powerful message of unity in our fight against terrorism. On September 5, 1972, a Palestinian terrorist group called Black September broke into the Munich Olympic Village, killed an Israeli athlete and coach, and took 9 other athletes and coaches hostage. A German police officer was killed and 9 hostages were murdered during a rescue attempt. In observing this minute of silence, as in our resolution, we commemorate the 40th anniversary of the 1972 Munich Olympic terrorist attack, remembering those who lost their lives and reject and repudiate terrorism as antithetical to the Olympic goal of peaceful competition.
Mr. President.
Senator from Illinois.
Mr. President, I want to thank the Senator from New York and my colleague, Senator Rubio from Florida, for calling this historic tragedy to our attention and this sad anniversary, the 40th anniversary of the killing of the Israeli participants in the Munich Olympics. Having just witnessed, as the Senator from New York noted, the spectacular Olympics that were staged in London, and realizing how the Olympics started as a way to transcend national differences and to create an Olympic global spirit, it was especially heartbreaking what happened in Munich. We followed it in those early days of television. It was being reported on by some of the sports announcers who were actually at the Olympics themselves. And it was hard to believe, as the hostages were being taken, that they would all be killed before it was over. I sincerely hope that we and the world will learn a lesson from this tragedy, a lesson that violence begets violence, that we need to bring an end to this sort of terrorist activity, stand together in that Olympic global spirit. My thanks to Senators Gillibrand and Rubio for their efforts to make that part of the London Olympics, but to make certain that this day has not been forgotten here on the floor of the United States Senate.
Mr. President.
The Senator from Maryland.
Mr. President, I want to thank Senator Gillibrand for bringing this moment to the attention of the United States Senate and the American people, and thank Senator Rubio, Senator Durbin for being here. It's hard to believe it's been 40 years. It's hard to believe it's been 40 years since that tragic event in which terrorists had the attention of the world in the Olympics in Munich. And it's hard to believe that over the last 40 years we've experienced so much of the violence from extremists and terrorists. Tomorrow we will commemorate the 11th anniversary of the attack on our own country. And we recognize that the only way that we can stand up to this type of extremism is to never forget and to rededicate ourselves to do everything we can to root out extremists, to root out terrorists, and to never forget the consequences of their actions. So I want to thank Senator Gillibrand and Senator Rubio for the resolution that we passed in this Congress to let those who were victimized 40 years ago to know that we won't forget them and that we continue to dedicate our efforts to root out this type of hatred, this type of extremism, to make sure that the Olympic spirit, which is world competition, which is to bring peace in the world, that spirit is alive and well in the United States Senate and the United States of America, and we will continue to commemorate what happened so that we don't forget and dedicate ourselves to a more peaceful world. With that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor.
I suggest the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Mr. President.
Senator from Vermont.
Mr. President, I ask that the call of quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection. Under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to the executive session to consider the following nomination, which the clerk will report.
Nominations. Stephanie Marie Rose of Iowa to be United States District Judge.
Mr. President, when the Senate...
This order, there will be 30 minutes of debate equally divided in the usual form.
And Mr. President, we're beginning about 3 minutes late, and I'd ask consent that the time be divided in such a way that the vote still start at 5:30.
Without objection.
Mr. President, when the Senate recessed more than a month ago, 22 judicial nominees to fill vacancies in courtrooms around the country, courtrooms that taxpayers had paid to have staffed, were left pending, awaiting a Senate vote. And today, Senate Republicans agreed to vote on just one of those nominees. Now, I want to commend Senator Harkin for working with Senator Grassley and the Majority Leader to get this vote on the nomination of Stephanie Rose of Iowa. And I would urge vote on the other nominees as well without further delay. There are currently 78 federal judicial vacancies. Judicial vacancies during the last few years have been at historically high levels, and they've remained near or above 80 for nearly the entire first term of the President. A key reason for these numerous vacancies and for the extensive backlog of nominees is the Senate Republicans allowed votes on just one district court nominee per week for the last 7 weeks before the August recess. It's an unnecessarily slow pace of consideration of judicial nominees, and it's a disservice to the American public. I think this across-the-board obstruction and foot-dragging since day one of President Obama's tenure means that we're likely to complete his first term with more judicial vacancies than we took office. Partisan obstruction has been particularly damaging with respect to federal trial courts. The sharp departure from the past, Senate Republicans have stalled Senate approval of district court nominees, including those Republican home state senators' support. In other words, Republican state senators who worked with President Obama to get a nominee they supported, they've been stalled too. I mention this because at this point in President Bush's first term, Senate Democrats have worked with Republicans to confirm 165 of his district court nominees. President Obama, for some reason, was treated entirely differently than President Bush was. Carl Tobias noted last month in a letter in the New York Times, Republican senators have created and applied practices that substantially depart from procedures employed in prior administrations, even as recently as President George W. Bush. The most important change is the refusal of the GOP leadership to enter voting agreements on well-qualified, uncontroversial district court nominees so they languished for months on the Senate floor. And of course, he's correct. I think of President Bush's first term, Democrats were in charge of the Senate for 17 months. We confirmed 100 of his judges those 17 months. Now, I know Republicans worked hard in the other 31 months, and they confirmed, I think, 104 or 105 of his judges. The irony is the Democrats, when they were in control, moved President Bush's nominees even faster than the Republicans, much faster than the Republicans did. But when you find Senate Republicans delaying and opposing President Obama's district court nominees, voting against more than a quarter of them, 36 out of 127, installing confirmations for months, even those supported by Republican senators, this president is being treated differently than any president since I have been in the Senate, and I came here time of President Ford. One of the Supreme Court, a Republican in the Supreme Court recently observed that it's bad for the legal system as a whole. He said it makes the judiciary look politicized when it's not, and it has to stop. Now, district courts in particular shouldn't be politicized. They're chosen, not an ideological litmus test, they're chosen based on their abilities, and of course they're bound by the decisions of the courts of appeals of their district. So I wish they would schedule a debate and vote. The 18 district court nominees who could be confirmed with strong bipartisan support without further delay. If they were allowed to have a vote, they'd all be confirmed with strong bipartisan votes. A dozen of them, incidentally, would fill judicial emergency vacancies. In 2008, we can do this even in September of presidential. Actually, I'll give you an example, Mr. President. In 2008, the final year of President Bush's presidency, Senate Democrats were willing to confirm 10 of his district court nominees in a single day by unanimous consent. It took a few seconds. Early in that Republican presidency, and again with a Democratic majority, we confirmed 18 judicial nominees in one day. Vacancies went down to 60 throughout the country on the way down to finally to 28. Well, I ask consent my full statement be placed in the record. I see the
objection.
I see the distinguished senior senator from Iowa here. I would reserve the balance of my time and ask it to be under the control of the Senator Harkin of Iowa, and I yield the floor.
Senator from Iowa.
I thank the chairman of the committee, Senator Leahy, for his courtesies. I rise in support of the nomination of Stephanie Marie Rose to be United States District Judge for the Southern District of Iowa. In addition, she has the support of Senator Harkin and is well regarded throughout my home state of Iowa. She was reported out of our committee on voice vote. She was previously confirmed by this Senate in her current position, U.S. Attorney, Northern District of Iowa. Ms. Rose is a Hawkeye through and through, receiving 2 degrees from the University of Iowa, B.A. 1994, J.D. 1996. Obviously, Ms. Rose was on a fast track through law school. After graduation from law school, she wisely chose to remain in Iowa, and Iowa is fortunate for that decision. She first served as law clerk in the U.S. Attorney's Office, Northern District of Iowa. In 1997, she was hired as a full-time attorney in that same office, where she has risen through the ranks and now heads that office. She served as Special Assistant U.S. Attorney 97 through 99 and as Assistant U.S. Attorney 99 to the year 2009. During this time, she was lead counsel in the prosecution of more than 250 cases. These cases spanned a wide range of legal issues, from violent crimes and drug offense to immigration violations and money laundering. Additionally, she has handled approximately 45 federal civil cases. These cases have included post-conviction relief and asset forfeiture matters, as well as freedom of information and property return lawsuits. In 2009, Ms. Rose was nominated by our President and then confirmed by the Senate to serve as U.S. Attorney, Northern District, Iowa. In this role, she oversees most every aspect of the office. This includes overseeing the civil and criminal work completed by office staff and making final determinations regarding charging decisions, plea offers, and civil settlements. The American Bar Association Standing Committee on the Federal Judiciary unanimously rated Ms. Rose as well qualified for this position of district judge. In addition, she is supported by the legal community and judges throughout our state. Newspaper articles published in the Cedar Rapids Gazette on February 2 and February 20th this year captured some of that support. I ask unanimous consent to insert these 2 articles in the congressional record.
Without objection.
Assistant U.S. Attorney C.J. Williams described Ms. Rose's ability to quickly comprehend complex issues. Former Assistant U.S. Attorney Bob Teig, who retired last year after 31 years, said Thursday that Rose will make an excellent federal judge. He went on to say, quote, "She has experience in the courtroom and as an administrator. She has a broad view of the federal legal system, and she's very intelligent. Stephanie will make a good addition to the federal bench," end of quote. U.S. District Judge Mark Bennett said, quote, "She is very skilled. She doesn't have a personal agenda. She goes by the law," end quote. U.S. District Judge John Jarvie of the Southern District said her prosecution record is impressive, noting, quote, "Stephanie has won the respect of prosecutors and defense lawyers," end quote. Ms. Rose is also a member of the Iowa Academy of Trial Lawyers. Now, membership in the Academy is limited to just 250 attorneys whose primary focus is on trial advocacy. Membership in this distinguished group is by invitation only with unanimous approval by the Board of Governors. So Ms. Rose is one of only 15 women in the Academy. Mr. Leon Spies, the gentleman who nominated Ms. Rose for the Academy, said he nominated her because she exhibited exactly what the organization strives for, quote, the highest quality of trial advocacy and ethical responsibilities to clients and the law, end of quote. If confirmed, and I'm sure she will be confirmed, Ms. Rose will be the first woman to serve as federal judge in the Southern District and only the second woman to serve on the federal bench in Iowa's history. So I congratulate Ms. Rose and wish her well as she assumes her duties as a U.S. District Judge. With her confirmation today, the Senate will have confirmed 156 of President Obama's nominees to the district and circuit courts. The fact is, we have confirmed over 80% of President Obama's district nominees. During the last presidential election year, the year 2008, the Senate confirmed a total of 28 judges, 24 district and 4 circuit. This presidential election year, we will have exceeded those numbers. We have confirmed 5 circuit nominees, and Judge Rose will be the 29th district judge confirmed. That is a total of 34 judges this year versus 28 in the last presidential election year. Yet, even as we make consistent progress in filling judicial vacancies, there are still voices out there claiming otherwise. For example, early last month, the Des Moines Register of my state ran an editorial titled, quote, "Judges remain hostages in the Senate," end of quote. They stated in that editorial, in reference to the nomination of Ms. Rose, they stated, quote, "She will be lucky to come up for confirmation when the Senate reconvenes." Of course, the vote had already been scheduled at that point, but they overlooked that fact. The Register and other critics who erroneously blame vacancy rates in the federal judiciary on Republic obstructionism overlook other facts as well. You've heard me say on the Senate floor that the Senate can only confirm judges that have been sent up here from the White House. So if the White House hasn't sent judges up here, we can't obviously confirm judges that haven't been submitted to the Senate. So in regard to that, I'd like to point out something from the New York Times, because a lot of times I think the New York Times would not do much to give us a basis for our position that we've done a pretty good job of confirming judges, and why aren't judges up here? So in an article dated August 17th, 2012, shed some light on this very subject. In that article, quote, the title of the article, "Obama lags in judicial picks, limiting his mark on the courts," end of quote. This newspaper, The Times, points out how President Obama made judicial nominations a lower political priority. The article discusses how 2 Supreme Court nominations, personnel upheavals, and the President's emphasis upon diversity also slowed the nominations process for lower court judges. In fact, even as we continue to confirm judges, the President continues to lag in nominations, including nominations to so-called judicial emergencies. Today, only 32 of the 78 current vacancies have a nominee up here from the White House. Stated differently, nearly 60% of the current vacancies are without nominees. That has been the pattern for most of this administration. So once again, I wanted to set the record straight, and I hope I have set it straight. Republicans have been more than fair to this President and his judicial nominees, considering the fact that we have so many vacancies that haven't had a nominee submitted to the Senate for our consideration. Again, I congratulate Ms. Rose, and I yield the floor.
I suggest the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Acock.
Senator from Iowa.
President, I ask that further proceedings under the quorum call be dispensed with.
Objection.
Mr. President, I spoke earlier in greater detail about the nomination of Stephanie Rose to serve as a district court judge in Iowa's Southern District. Now, that's the vote that's coming up here at 5:30. So as the Senate begins to vote, I just wanted to reiterate what an outstanding nominee she is. Indeed, it's no surprise that the American Bar Association rated her unanimously well qualified, which is their highest rating. After graduating from law school in just 2 years in the top 5% of her class, she served for 12 years as an assistant U.S. attorney in the Northern District of Iowa under both attorneys that were appointed by Republican presidents and Democratic presidents. She was lead counsel in 260 felony cases, made 34 oral arguments before the Eighth Circuit. Most notably, she received a national award from the Department of Justice for her work in prosecuting the largest unlawful Internet pharmacy case in the U.S. Her work was so impressive that in 2009 I recommended her to the President to serve as United States Attorney. And in 2009, the United States Senate unanimously confirmed her. And she has been outstanding in her work as a U.S. Attorney since then. Throughout her career of public service, Ms. Rose has worked to uphold the rule of law, made our neighborhood safer, promoted civil rights, and advanced the cause of justice. She possesses all of the qualifications necessary to be a remarkably good federal judge. She is a superb attorney, and among jurists, prosecutors, and the defense bar, she has a reputation as someone who is unfailingly fair and ethical, and who possesses exceptional legal ability, intellect, and judgment. And finally, let me reiterate again my great appreciation to Senator Leahy, the chairman, but also again to Senator Grassley, my senior senator from the state of Iowa, to their staffs, especially Jeremy Paris, Ted Lehman, and Senator Grassley, Chief of Staff David Young, for their support and all their assistance in getting this nomination through. I also want to thank my Chief of Staff, Brian Alberg, Dan Goldberg, Derek Miller, and Pam Smith on my staff and my committee staff. In essence, Mr. President, Ms. Rose is a person of truly outstanding intellect and character. She's exceptionally qualified to serve as United States District Judge for the Southern District of Iowa. I urge all of my colleagues to support her confirmation when the vote occurs here in just a few minutes. And with that, Mr. President, I yield the floor. And suggests the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Senator from Iowa. Without objection. Is there sufficient seconds? There appears to be sufficient seconds. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka, Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Balkis, Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Bingaman, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown of Massachusetts, Mr. Brown of Ohio, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Conrad, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Crapo, Mr. DeMint, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heller. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hutchison. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inouye. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans.
Give me a rain check.
Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Kerry. Mr. Kirk. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Cole. Mr. Kyle.
Mark.
Ms. Landrieu. Mr. Lautenberg. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Levin. Mr. Lieberman. Mr. Lugar. Mr. Manchin. Mr. McCain. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Ms. Mikulski. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson of Nebraska. Mr. Nelson of Florida. Mr. Paul. Mr. Portman. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schumer.
Thank you, buddy.
Mr. Sessions. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Snow. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall of Colorado. Mr. Udall of New Mexico. Mr. Vitter. Mr. Warner. Mr. Webb. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker.
No, you can't borrow my
Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Bennett, Bingaman, Blumenthal, Bozeman, Brown of Massachusetts, Carper, Chambliss, Coates, Conrad, Coons, Gillibrand, Grassley, Harkin, Heller, Inhofe, Inouye, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of South Dakota, Cole, Leahy, Lee, Levin, Manchin, Nelson of Nebraska, Nelson of Florida, Pryor, Sanders, Udall of New Mexico, Warner, Webb, Wicker. Mr. DeMint voted in the negative. Mr. Lugar, aye. Mr. Sessions, aye. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Cardin, aye. Ms. Ayotte, aye. Mr. Akaka, aye. Mr. Franken, aye. Mr. Roberts, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mrs. Boxer. Mrs. Boxer. Aye. Mr. McCain. Mr. McCain. Aye. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins. Aye. Ms. Snow. Ms. Snow. Aye. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown of Ohio. Aye. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr. Aye. Mr. Cochran. Mr. Cochran. Aye. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby. Aye. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rockefeller. Aye. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island. Aye. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden. Aye. Ms. Mikulski. Ms. Mikulski. Aye. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein. Aye. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran. Aye. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez. Aye. Mr. Tester. Mr. Tester. Aye. Mr. Kerry. Mr. Kerry. Aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Aye. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey. Aye. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Hatch. Aye. Ms. Cantwell. Ms. Cantwell. Aye. Mrs. McCaskill. Mrs. McCaskill. Aye. Mr. Risch. Mr. Risch. Aye. Mr. Lieberman. Mr. Lieberman. Aye. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Crapo. Aye. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Baucus. Aye. Mr. Enzi. Mr. Enzi. Aye. Mr. Udall, Colorado. Mr. Udall, Colorado. Aye. Ms. Landrieu. Ms. Landrieu. Aye. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Merkley. Aye. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven. Aye. Mrs. Hagan. Mrs. Hagan, aye. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Kyle. Mr. Kyle, aye. Mr. Toomey, aye. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Mr. Blunt, aye. Mr. Corker, aye. Mrs. Hutchison. Mrs. Hutchison, aye. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn, aye.